the spring of 1927, a dark, obsession-driven madness swept through the aviation world. The prize was simple, prestigious, and terrifying. $25,000, worth nearly $500,000 today, for the first aviator to fly non-stop between New York and Paris across the wild, unforgiving Atlantic Ocean. To the public, it was the ultimate romantic adventure. To the men actually climbing into those early flying machines, it was a bloody meat grinder. In the months leading up to May 1927, the Atlantic turned into a graveyard for the world's most decorated pilots. Million-dollar multi-engine aircraft were collapsing into flaming wreckage on takeoff. Decorated World War I flying aces, naval commanders, and veteran navigators were vanishing over the dark, freezing waters of the North Atlantic, their bodies never to be found. The consensus among the world's leading aeronautical experts was unanimous. Crossing 3,600 miles of open ocean required massive, heavy, multi-engine aircraft. You needed 3 engines for redundancy, so that if one failed, the others could keep you aloft. You needed a full crew, a lead pilot, a co-pilot to share the crushing exhaustion, and a master navigator to compute complex celestial mathematics in the dark. And then came a 25-year-old unknown airmail pilot from Missouri named Charles Lindbergh. When Lindbergh revealed his strategy for the transatlantic flight, the aviation establishment considered him suicidal. He rejected 3 engines. He wanted only 1. He rejected a crew. He wanted to fly completely alone. And most shockingly of all, he designed an airplane that had no front windshield, a machine where the pilot literally could not see where he was flying. Newspapers branded him the Flying Fool. Competitors assumed he would crash into the sea within hours. Yet on May 21, 1927, after 33.5 agonizing hours in the air, Charles Lindbergh landed the Spirit of St. Louis at Le Bourget Field in Paris, stepping out into a roaring crowd of 150,000 people to become the most famous human being on the planet. So what did Charles Lindbergh know about flying the Atlantic that killed the seasoned pilots before him? He understood a cold, unforgiving equation of physics that every multi-engine team in the world was ignoring. Weight is the absolute enemy of survival. To understand why other pilots were dying, you first have to understand the nightmare of early aviation engineering. In 1927, airplanes were fragile contraptions of lightweight wood, stretched canvas, and crude steel tubing. Engines were notoriously unreliable, prone to throwing pistons, freezing up, or bursting into flames without warning. The logic of famous pilots like René Fonck, a French flying ace, and Commander Richard Byrd, a legendary American explorer, seemed totally sound. If engines fail, build a bigger plane with more engines. René Fonck stepped into a massive, luxurious 3-engine Sikorsky biplane equipped with leather seats, sofa-like accommodations, and a crew of 4. Commander Byrd selected a giant 3-engine Fokker trimotor. They believed that multiple engines provided safety, but they missed the brutal, cascading trap hidden in the mathematics of flight. Adding a 2nd and 3rd engine added immense structural weight. To carry those heavy engines, you needed a massive, heavy fuselage and giant wings. To carry that heavy aircraft across 3,000 miles of ocean, you needed thousands of pounds of additional gasoline. And to lift thousands of pounds of additional gasoline, you needed even larger, heavier engines. It was a deadly, self-defeating spiral. When René Fonck attempted to take off from Long Island in his massive Sikorsky, the sheer, crushing weight of the fuel and extra engines overloaded the landing gear. The plane snapped its framework, careened off the end of the runway, plummeted into a ravine, and burst into a towering inferno, burning 2 of his crew members alive inside. The multi-engine planes weren't safer. They were flying bombs so heavy that they could barely lift off the ground, and so sluggish that if a single engine failed during takeoff, the remaining engines couldn't carry the dead weight of the giant airframe anyway. Charles Lindbergh looked at the charred wreckage of those multi-engine giants and saw the trap clearly. He realized that every extra pound of aircraft, every extra engine, every piece of luxury, and every extra crew member was a direct threat to his life. Lindbergh calculated that a single crew member, a second pilot, or a navigator weighed roughly 150 pounds. If he eliminated that person, he could replace their body weight with 25 extra gallons of gasoline. Those 25 gallons translated to nearly 3 extra hours of flight time, the precise margin between reaching the coast of France or running out of fuel 200 miles out in the Atlantic Ocean. Lindbergh chose to be his own navigator, his own mechanic, and his own radio operator. He stripped his operation down to a cold, razor-sharp mathematical balance. One man, one engine, and as much fuel as the airframe could physically lift. When Lindbergh walked into the Ryan Airlines factory in San Diego to build his custom plane, he didn't ask for comfort, safety, or luxury. He asked for efficiency. He selected a single 9-cylinder Wright Whirlwind radial engine, a masterpiece of modern engineering that offered the highest power-to-weight ratio available in the world. Lindbergh trusted that a single, meticulously maintained engine was vastly less likely to fail than 3 complex engines running simultaneously. Then, Lindbergh made the most radical, terrifying design choice in aviation history. In every conventional airplane, the pilot sat behind a clear glass windshield, looking out over the engine nose to see the horizon. The fuel tanks were placed behind the pilot, in the fuselage or in the wings. Lindbergh realized that if he suffered a hard landing or a minor crash on takeoff with hundreds of gallons of gasoline sitting directly behind his seat, the sloshing fuel tank would act as a massive battering ram, crushing his spine against the engine block and burning him alive. He refused to let that happen. Lindbergh ordered the engineers to place the massive 375-gallon main fuel tank in the very center of gravity of the airplane, directly in front of the pilot's seat, between his face and the engine. That single decision solved the center of gravity weight problem and protected his body from being crushed in a crash. But it introduced an insane physical reality. The fuel tank completely blocked his forward vision. When Lindbergh sat in the wicker cockpit seat of the Spirit of St. Louis, he was staring directly into a flat, solid sheet of corrugated aluminum. He had no windshield. He could not look straight ahead. To see what was in front of him, Lindbergh had to either lean his head out of a small side window into a 100-mile-per-hour freezing slipstream, or use a tiny, custom-built periscope that popped out of the left side of the fuselage like a submarine instrument. The aviation community was stunned. The press thought he was insane. How could a man fly across 3,000 miles of stormy, pitch-black ocean when he couldn't even see out the front of his own airplane? Lindbergh knew something the critics didn't. Once you are airborne over the open Atlantic, there are no mountain peaks to hit, no traffic to dodge, and no landmarks to see. You don't fly across an ocean by looking out the windshield. You fly by staring at your instrument panel, your compass, your turn and bank indicator, and your altimeter. Forward vision was an expensive luxury that added aerodynamic drag and structural weight. Lindbergh sacrificed his eyes to save fuel. He went even further. Lindbergh refused to carry a radio, claiming the heavy vacuum tube equipment and copper antenna weight were useless over the mid-Atlantic, where no land station could hear him anyway. He refused to carry a heavy rubber life raft, opting instead for a tiny, inflatable inner tube. He refused to pack a parachute, knowing that leaping out of a plane over the mid-Atlantic in May meant freezing to death in the water within 10 minutes anyway. He shaved off every fraction of an ounce. He cut the margins off his paper navigation charts to save a few grams of paper. He tore the unused blank pages out of his logbook. He replaced his heavy leather pilot's seat with a stiff, lightweight wicker chair. Every single decision was driven by an unyielding, cold logic. Fuel is life. Weight is death. On the morning of May 20th, 1927, at Roosevelt Field in Long Island, New York, a heavy drizzle rained down on a muddy, rutted runway. The Spirit of St. Louis was loaded with 450 gallons of gasoline, weighing over 2,700 pounds. The tires were bulging under the extreme pressure. The plane was so heavy that the axle frames were bowing toward the mud. Other pilots looked at the weather and the muddy runway and refused to take off. Lindbergh looked at his mathematical charts, climbed into his cramped wicker chair behind his giant aluminum fuel tank, and started his single right whirlwind engine. The takeoff was a harrowing, hair-raising gamble with death. The heavy plane bounced sluggishly down the muddy track, struggling to gain lift. It lurked near the ground, barely clearing a row of tractor vehicles at the end of the field, and skimmed just feet above telephone wires before slowly, painfully climbing into the gray morning clouds over the ocean. He was airborne. But now, Lindbergh faced his deadliest, most invisible enemy, one that had killed scores of long-distance aviators before him: sleep deprivation. Before he even took off from New York, Lindbergh had been awake for over 20 hours due to nervous energy and pre-flight preparations. He was now facing a grueling 30-plus-hour flight across a pitch-black ocean, flying completely alone. In a multi-crew aircraft, pilots took turns sleeping while the co-pilot held the controls. Lindbergh had no co-pilot. If he fell asleep for even 60 seconds, the plane would tip into a graveyard spiral and dive straight into the ocean. Here again, Lindbergh's radical engineering choices saved his life. Most aircraft designers built planes that were naturally stable, planes that, if left alone, would level their own wings and fly straight. Lindbergh had deliberately instructed Ryan Airlines to make the Spirit of St. Louis slightly unstable. The airplane was twitchy, sensitive, and aerodynamically out of balance. If Lindbergh loosened his grip on the stick or drifted off for a fraction of a second, the nose would drop or a wing would dip violently. The plane forced him to stay awake. It demanded his continuous, active, muscle reflex control every single second of the flight. The instability of the aircraft was his personal alarm clock. During the night, over the dark, desolate North Atlantic, the temperature plummeted. Dense fog enveloped the plane. Ice began to form on the wings, adding deadly weight and ruining aerodynamic lift. Without a forward windshield, Lindbergh had to reach his bare hand out the side window into the freezing slipstream to feel the texture of the ice building on the struts. He flew through pitch-black storm clouds, staring intently at the tiny, glowing radium needles of his instruments, fighting off terrifying hallucinations brought on by extreme exhaustion. He felt ghosts sitting in the fuselage behind him, speaking to him in gentle voices. His eyes burned like hot cinders. His muscles cramped in his tiny wicker seat. Yet, hour after grueling hour, his single engine hummed with flawless precision. His mathematical fuel calculations held true. His decision to carry extra gasoline instead of extra crew members gave him the precise safety margin he needed to navigate around massive storm fronts. On the afternoon of May 21st, after 33 hours and 30 minutes in the air, Lindbergh spotted a dark, jagged line on the horizon through his side window. It was the coast of Ireland. He was precisely on course. His navigation, calculated alone on stripped-down paper maps, had brought him across 3,000 miles of empty ocean with pinpoint accuracy. A few hours later, as night fell over Europe, Lindbergh flew over the lights of Paris, located Le Bourget airfield, and brought the Spirit of St. Louis down onto the dark grass. When he cut the ignition on his single engine, over 100,000 frantic, cheering French citizens broke through the military barriers, surging toward the tiny silver plane to lift the exhausted young pilot onto their shoulders. So, what did we actually miss about the story of Charles Lindbergh? We missed the fact that his historic achievement was not a triumph of reckless, romantic bravery or blind luck. It was a triumph of brutal, uncompromising engineering logic. The world's famous aviators died because they trusted in the illusion of safety, believing that bigger planes, more engines, and larger crews made them invincible. They built heavy flying castles that collapsed under their own weight. Charles Lindbergh survived because he stripped away every single human comfort, embraced the terrifying physics of weight, and had the courage to fly blind into the dark, trusting a single engine, a fuel tank in front of his face, and an unstable plane that kept him awake. Every other pilot tried to survive the Atlantic by making their flying machine bigger. Charles Lindbergh was the only man who had the cold brilliance to make himself smaller.